Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Rader and this video is for teachers of participation in government. And in this short video, we'll take a look at the concept of checks and balances, and we'll consider a variety of strategies that you can use to help your students grasp this concept. And there's many ways that you can do it. So you could use historical examples from US history, you could use court cases, or in the case of this lesson as developed by the Passport to Social Studies digital curriculum, we'll look at a total of 9 different scenarios. And there's a lot of flexibility built into this lesson. So for example, if your school has block scheduling, you may want to employ all 9 different scenarios, or perhaps have an activity if you're in person, having students use chart paper to really think through the scenarios and maybe present their cases to their classmates, so on and so forth. If you're in a single session school where you have maybe 40 or 45 minutes, perhaps you will make some cuts and you'll consider the scenarios that are most critical for your students to really understand the role that checks and balances and separation of powers have for the federal government. And I hope at this point in the fall semester, you're pretty familiar with the Passport to Social Studies digital curriculum and the Passport to Social Studies curriculum in general. So I won't spend a lot of time looking at the note to teachers, but I will note that this lesson is adapted from the Civics for All curriculum on page 84. It's lesson 6 on checks and balances. So you can find additional materials to support instruction, just to provide additional flexibility for implementation. And this slide speaks to a variety of resources for teachers, for students with disabilities. So the main emphasis of this lesson really will be on checks and balances. And if this is the first time you've seen this on the slides of the digital curriculum, there'll be plenty of slides where students will be able to write their responses to particular prompts in these blue boxes anytime they see this pencil icon. So the introduction or model to this lesson is going to look at an initial quote from Bronte Montesquieu, an Enlightenment thinker, and setting the foundations for separation of powers. So you may want to have a student read the quote aloud and to really to think for a minute, to write down their own response, perhaps to share it with the person sitting next to them, if they are in fact in person, and if some of the social distancing requirements that are present now in the spring 2021 semester are relaxed. Um, and then from there to call on students to share out their thoughts on this quote from Montesquieu and his view of power, and what words kind of speak to that view of power. In terms of the modeling process, we'll look at a short excerpt from The Spirit of the Laws, really looking at Book 11 in 1758. And we'll want to consider the claim that Montesquieu is making, the argument that Montesquieu is making, and what foundational aspect of American government is being used. So one technique that I do employ is to use different color highlighting to point out different things to my students. So for example, in the first slide, we can see a very clear example about the claim that Montesquieu is making about power and the rights of the subjects. We can see in this next slide, really looking at specifically with the arguments, right? Very specifically about what's the problem if the legislative and the executive branches are merged together within a single individual. And really thinking about the foundational aspects in American history, looking at the Bill of Rights to the Constitution in green, showing that the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, which was one of the major grievances that the American colonists had articulated in their list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And we can see on these slides, this gives students opportunities to click in and to be able to add their text so that you can also easily check for understanding if you are circulating around the classroom. In terms of the checks and balances infographic, it may be really hard for students to read. So if they use the magnifying glass bar, we can either do fit to page or we can click zoom in. And and we can then see specific components of checks and balances. And it may make sense to have a student read it aloud to really process what it might be and try to think for a minute and try to come up with some examples as to how these various checks exist within the underlying powers of the American governmental system. And then there are some additional discussion questions that students can make from text to text connections, thinking about what is in the image and what is in Montesquieu's arguments, using the infographic to articulate their own definition of checks and balances, and then to come up with a consensus definition of a class, and to think about some ways that one branch can check other branches is a very easy entry point for students to be able to participate in the discussion. And then in the independent work, as I mentioned at the top of the video, there's 9 different scenarios. So there's a lot that the students can process. And if you have an extended block of time with students, it may make sense to work through all of the different scenarios to consider the actions that can be taken by the government, which branches could possibly check the power of the other branch, and really think about why checks and balances are needed for a scenario like this. Uh, these scenarios work their way through all the way from scenario 1 all the way down to scenario 9. Let's see where this is scenario 8, and then scenario 9 is here. Uh, in a complementary video, which is on the next tab that I designed for students, I chose just a few scenarios to use to help students who may still be in a remote setting, or to help students preview the lesson if they're about to be exposed to it the next day, or even just to recap the material that they learned in class today with you. And again, the wrap up serves as a nice opportunity to check for understanding and to have students look at the various scenarios in combination, and to really think about how checks and balances either promote or hinder democracy or democratic action. And some of the examples really show the limits of particular branches. So, for example, one of the scenarios illustrates a Congress that is unwilling to pay for a tax proposal that the executive branch has as part of, say, a federal branch initiative, a part of the federal budget. And there's really not much that the president can do other than to try to convince legislatures to pass their budget resolution ideas. And then as a final check for understanding, students can submit the Google Doc into Google Classroom, or if you're having them work on pen and paper in a classroom, you could always have them turn in an exit ticket that has their response to this question. Could be a post-it note. I mean, there's a variety of ways that you can do that. And I just want to end the video by just showing you briefly the presentation that I'm going to be making for students, which really looks specifically at this infographic and how to navigate the magnifying glass tool to zoom in on a Google slide, and then to look at a few of the scenarios and really kind of break it down to consider what the issue is, what the Constitution says, and then what the relevant check and balance would be in that given situation. All right, I want to thank you all for your time. I hope everybody has a nice day, and I look forward to the next video in the series. Take care, everybody.